So here's a different kind of welcoming committee for Jesus.
Yeah.
So he's in his hometown and he's teaching in the synagogues on the Sabbath, and the listeners are there and they're like, "Hey, this is amazing, but isn't that Jesus?
Yeah.
Don't we know him?" And so they're recognizing that he has wisdom. They're recognizing that he exercises power and authority, but they're like, but that's Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important. It's important. It's so easy to forget, but it's important to remember. And we don't know this exactly, but we believe Jesus was roughly 30 to 33 when he was kind of in this ministry. It was roughly about that time. So for 29, 30 years, everybody around him knew him as Joseph's son. He was the carpenter. He was, Jim Gaffigan's got a really great joke. I wonder if that carpenter thing ever came up. It's like, hey, could you heal our son? And also, we'd like some shelves right here. But so he was known by that. He was just this guy in the town. And so how could he say, "You're not the Messiah. I've known you for 20 years." It's like it's like how could you say this? I've known, you think about it's funny. I've often heard about professional athletes, and they're at the top of their game, but like growing up, they would still lose to their older brother, because of that, and so
I always love seeing that guy who's like an investment banker somewhere. He's like, "Yeah, I struck out Ken Griffey Jr. in a high school game."
Exactly. Yeah. So it's hard to imagine, of course, that they like. You're not this, you're not that. I've been watching you play outside and all of these things for years and years.
I think it also speaks to maybe the nature of Jesus's life is that it was not one full of miracles and workings, right?
There was a time when it came, but before that, he was just a regular Joe.
Yeah.
The only record we have between his birth and basically when he began his ministry was in. I can't remember which one it's in, but he was like around 12 when they took him to the temple, and they came back and they forgot him there, and they didn't know where he was, and they came back and says, "When you know I would be in my Father's house." That's really the only record we have between birth and when he begins his ministry.
Yeah.
So, it's basically assumed that there's really no reason to believe that he did any of that before that time.
Absolutely.
And so it would be hard for let's say somebody believed that he did, okay, let's say you are Jesus. Let's say you are the Messiah. Let's say you do have these things. Why now?
Yeah.
Why not 20 years ago?
Right.
But again, there's, as we see so often in the Gospels, especially Mark, there is a time. And there is a time for a place, and the time had not come yet.
Right.
And it's God's timing, not ours.
Yeah, absolutely. They were amazed. Where did this come from? And I think the phrase he uses here, "and they took offense at him," is a very telling thing. Have you ever known somebody in your youth that was maybe not the, and I'm not suggesting this of Jesus, but there's maybe somebody you knew what they were like when they were younger, and then you find out in your adult life that they're like a doctor, and you're like, "Well, I'm not going there."
Yes,
right,
yeah.
And some of that might have to do with his upbringing. Okay, Jesus was a carpenter, and the term carpenter, by the way, is actually broader than just woodworking.
Yeah.
For them, it was like a builder. He was basically a construction guy.
Yeah.
It's like we talked about, with the house when they tore the roof down,
Yeah.
right? It's not just the wood shingles and things. There's brick and there's mortar and there's all these things. So Jesus had this kind of construction-y carpentry background.
Yeah.
And now he's preaching with wisdom and casting out demons with authority. And they're like, what
Where'd that come
happened?
from? Yeah.
And then because you know of his humble beginnings, you're like, kind of like, well, I also think of well, that could have been me.
Yeah.
We're all came from the same place. Why him? Why now? Why here?
Yeah.
To your point.
Yeah. So in my regular life, I'm a financial advisor, and I've known a lot of my other colleagues, a lot of people that started around the same time. Their family will not meet with them, because they've grown up. They will not listed to them as a financial advisor because it's, it's family and, maybe they don't want to have those conversations or they know them too well. They don't want something to go bad. But it's like sometimes your family is the hardest one to, sell in that sense, or in this sense, preach to.
Yeah, well, don't mix business with friendship, right? And I think there's something to be said about that. One of the things Jesus has been preaching is repentance.
Yeah.
We think about like confessing our own sins. It's almost easier to confess to a stranger.
Yeah, because you probably didn't sin against them. It's your family that you've wronged. Yeah,
exactly. So even as they're amazed at what he's doing, Jesus is amazed at their unbelief, right?
Yeah.
And it says here that while he's there, he's unable to do much, and he only heals a few sick people before he moves on. And I think what's important to note here is God incapable?
Yeah.
Like not in a sense of that things are impossible for him.
Yeah.
But like he is only capable in the sense that we allow him to be.
Right.
Right? We do have a level of autonomy in our lives, and I think this is something that philosophically unbelievers sometimes struggle with. But like God is not looking to necessarily rudely interrupt our lives. There's a time and a place that he does.
Yeah.
But he doesn't take control of us and our thoughts, our emotions. And we go back to the woman who got healed, right? He said, "It is by your faith that you have been healed." The power is in him. The access is in the faith.
Yeah.
Right? They don't have any faith in him. They can't access it.
Yeah.
Right? And I know like sometimes when we talk about unanswered prayer, we're really slow to say it's because of a lack of faith.
Yeah.
Right? We don't want people to feel bad.
That's the last thing we go, well, why could this not be? Well,
right. The truth is it could be a lack of faith.
Yeah.
Now we should approach that with gentleness, kindness, and love and really and honestly, you should approach that yourself.
Right.
As you're trying to understand why maybe things aren't lining up the way you think, but there can be a level of unbelief or lack of faith that hinders what God could do in your life.
Yeah, I was actually going to, you mentioned the woman in the last chapter who touched his clothes, and I was actually going to bring this up then because I knew that this was coming up. But yeah, you're absolutely right. He says, "It is your faith that has healed you." Well, if she had touched anybody else, her faith wouldn't have healed her. It was the fact that she had faith that she knew that if she touched Jesus, she would be healed. So you see here that their hearts are so hardened against Jesus that he's there is nothing impossible for him. He absolutely could, but this isn't really the right response. But why should he? Not. And I know that's a whole other can of worms. But and we see later in Mark, there's a man that comes and he asks for his son. He says, basically, Jesus kind of says, "Do you believe?" I says, "Of course I believe. I believe that you can do this." And he says, "Well, because of your belief, you." And that's a very poor summation and a simplification. But basically, what I'm saying is, multiple times we see it. Your faith has healed you, or it's because of your faith that, or it's because of your unbelief that. It's important to remember that, yes, God is in control. Jesus is the one that heals us, but we have some skin in the game too.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. There is a theme of faith and authority throughout the book of Mark.
Yeah.
And if you don't have faith that God has authority over all things, then you're not going to tap into that.
Yeah, and this is another tough thing because, I know people that have prayed and prayed and prayed, and those prayers aren't answered, or God doesn't do those things that they asked him, and they feel guilty because it's like, wasn't my? I actually did. I had a person just a couple months ago. They prayed and prayed and prayed for God to heal this person in their life, and God didn't, and they ended up dying, and she was just still really distraught over this. Like, is this? It's like, it's not your fault that she died. It's not
Yeah.
your fault. Don't think that because of your lack of faith, she died of this, but she was still really hung up on that. So, we're talking about both sides of the coin here. But we also have to remember that, yes, it is for God to heal us, we have to have that faith.
Yeah. But
it's still up to him.
Yeah.
To do that.
Well, I think we talked about this with James when we went through the book of James way back when. We talked about how there's this concept of, first of all, you have to believe. When you pray, you need to believe.
Yeah.
Right? But you also need to pray God's will.
Right.
Right? So if you're not in alignment with God's will, then you're not going to see the answer that you're wanting, right?
Right.
It's hard to sit here and say that it's God's will for someone to go ahead and perish.
Right.
But again, we talked about this a little bit in the last episode. God sees things in an eternal picture where you see things in a finite picture.
Yeah.
And there is life beyond this life, right? Mm-hmm. And, sometimes we're not going to see things the way we want to see them here.
Yeah.
We have to accept that there's more to it. There's more behind it. Just because we can't think of a good reason doesn't mean there isn't one.
Yeah.
Right.
And in the situation that I gave, when I was praying for her and I said, God, remind her that you will see her again.
Yeah.
This life, as you say, is finite. Heaven is forever. And, while it sucks that they're not here with us, mm-hmm. And we're kind of getting into whole other things here, but why not? We wish that they would be here, but mm-hmm. they're better off in heaven, and so, because they're in the presence of God, and so God has, while in this situation, her, God didn't heal this friend of hers, but He was doing other things in her life that were amazing. I said, and so I made sure to remind her of that. It says, yeah, that didn't happen, but look at what is,
Yeah, absolutely.